As the three young princes made their way through the market, they entered into the heart of the festival, where the bakers and cooks had prepared a great feast across a banquet table. One could sit down at the table and be served by the young maidens, who happily distributed plates piled high with the most delicious-smelling food. Not far from the banquet table was the center of the marketplace, where men and women danced gaily to the music provided by a crowd of musicians gathered at the far end of the circle. Figures in both elegant gowns and tattered working garbs smiled and danced alongside one another, singing out their songs of praises to the goddess. Atticus, Salvador, and Marcus took their seats at the banquet table, watching the thrilling scene with smiling faces. Beautiful young maidens with braided hair and dainty features served them plates of splendid-smelling food. The princes enjoyed their meals heartily, laughing to one another and taking pleasure in one another's company. But Salvador had not forgotten the look on his brother's face as he turned the corner into the dining room for the first time. Salvador was silently amused with himself, finally having something to lord over his older brother's head. He had been dwelling on this for quite a while as they enjoyed their meal, but his thoughts halted instantly by the sight across the courtyard. The sight he witnessed struck him so deeply that it chilled the very marrow in his bones. It was a Fabian, a woman with golden hair who danced in the heart of the circle. It had been over 7 years since his eyes had seen one of their kind, and it was, he believed, the Fabians that were responsible for the death of his parents. He was unaware, of course, that it was not the Fabians that were responsible for the death of the king and queen, but the exiles who served the Dark Lord Devane. But over the past 7 years, Salvador had prepared himself to avenge his parents' death, and here was one of them, one of those beings responsible for his loss. But this girl, she was entirely unlike the creatures he had pictured during that time. Her long golden hair fell loosely down her back as she danced. The soft fabric of her flowing violet gown flared about her slender form as she turned in step with the music. Her features were gentle ones. Her face was slightly flushed from dancing, but glowing with youth and beauty. Her hair glistened in the torchlight and wisped with the turn of her head as she gazed over her shoulder into the crowd. Her fair complexion without blemish, and her lovely eyes sparkling like emeralds in the fading light of the evening. Salvador watched her closely, wondering how such a lovely creature could be responsible for the death of his parents. Silently, he rose from his seat at the banquet table. Atticus and Marcus lifted their eyes to see him, confused. He had left half of his meal untouched on his plate, and the rag which he had used to wipe his face was still clutched in his right hand before it fell from his grasp to the ground. Salvador's eyes followed her graceful movements as she drifted through the circle of dancers in elegant glides. The crowd of dancers parted for her. The music had shifted from the joyous tune that had greeted them as they arrived to a low and ardent tone. The slow regression of all but the deep string instruments gave the music an ominous air, and the maiden, who had drawn the attention of most of the crowd, seemed to be in perfect stride with every strain of that sinister melody. Finally, her emerald eyes met with Salvador's pale blue gaze. She seemed to halt for a moment, realizing that she was the focus of his intense fixation. But she continued to dance, turning her head to gaze over her shoulder at Salvador to see that he still stood there, watching her closely. But not only in wonder of her beauty, but in bewilderment as he questioned himself and the beliefs he had clung to for the past years. Whatever his reasoning had been, Salvador considered her different than other Fabians. Perhaps the others were savage beasts, vicious murderers and fiends, but not this one. Not this one. He stepped away from the table, leaving Atticus and Marcus to smile and chuckle to each other over Salvador's unbroken attention to the girl. True, they were both in agreement that she was indeed lovely, but they could not understand Salvador's deep fixation with her, laughing heartily and returning to their meals as they watched Salvador move through the crowd. Atticus watched curiously as Salvador reached the edge of the dancing circle where the figures danced about to the music, wondering what Salvador intended to do. He swept past them, moving toward the maiden in the violet gown at a speed that surely would have frightened her if she had noticed his approach. But it was not until he was standing directly behind her that she again peered over her shoulder, only to be taken aback by his immediate presence and was startled into stumbling. But Atticus was pleased to see that Salvador caught her arm, allowing her to regain her balance before confusion washed over her face completely. The expression on her face resembled fear, but her eyes still glimmered with a spark of fascination. Salvador was not bothered by her confusion or surprise, and wasted no time in stating that he had seen her dancing and could not miss the opportunity to share a dance with the loveliest girl at the festival. She seemed charmed by his confidence, her prior nervousness fading as his warm smile reassured her. Her thin lips curved into a pleasant smile, and her dark eyelashes flickered as she introduced herself in a sweet-sounding voice as Justine. Her name rolled over her tongue in a sweet twist of her Canadak accent. Salvador repeated the name, completely taken with her. With a soft smile, she accepted his hand to dance. He watched her expression carefully, and she turned her face away shyly from his invasive gaze. Atticus was surprised to find that Salvador knew how to dance. Salvador had never been taught as a child, neither had Atticus. Atticus had learned to dance by attending festivities hosted by some of the surrounding kingdoms, but Salvador had never once attended. And yet there he was, leading her across the circle in polished steps with the music. Perhaps Salvador had not been spending all of his time in the chamber, as he had thought. But Atticus noticed there was something about the way he floated around her, the smooth steps and the sharp gaze, that felt almost threatening. He was watching her, observing, and almost memorizing her movements as though he did not fully trust her. Justine returned her eyes shyly to Salvador's, finding that he was still watching her intently. Neither of them acknowledged any of the dancers beside them, and Atticus wondered if the two had forgotten that they were being watched by a crowd. Atticus turned his head to look at Marcus, who had not touched his plate since Salvador had stood up from his place beside them. Marcus seemed as stunned as Atticus was. For the life of him, Atticus could not explain it, nor could he tear his eyes away from the sight. Atticus had not noticed the smile on Salvador's lips until he raised his head for a moment to gaze up at his friends, who watched in bewilderment from the banquet table. The music was drawing to a close, and Salvador took a step back from the girl. Her eyes flickered again, and she lowered her head with a sweet smile, telling Salvador that he was a splendid dancing partner. He stated that the pleasure had been his, bowing deeply to her. As he bowed, his long black hair parted and fell across his shoulder. Justine gasped gently in fascination at the sight of his cluster of glistening silver hair. Unthinking, she reached out her dainty hand and parted the hair to reveal the silver more clearly. He gazed up at her from his deep bow, somewhat surprised at first, but he smiled as he realized that his hair had parted to reveal his fascinating trait. Justine pulled her hand away, apologizing, and stated that she had acted without thinking. But he chuckled, asking if she was intrigued by the silver hair. She nodded, telling him that it was stunning. And it was indeed, the pure silver strands falling wispily down his back amid the thick threads of coal black. She told him that, surely, he must be highly favored by the goddess to be blessed with such a trait. He nodded, telling her that he had always believed that the goddess smiled upon him. He felt no shame in his pride, and he took pleasure in seeing the wonder in her eyes. But to his surprise, she curtsied to him deeply, and stated that the man blessed of the goddess deserves to be honored. He was slightly taken aback by this, but deeply satisfied to be held in such high regard by this lovely creature. Returning her eyes to meet his, she raised her fragile little hand to her ear. A matching set of crystal earrings dangled from her ears. With one swift movement, she unhooked one of the crystals and held it gently in her hands. She told him that these earrings had been blessed by her people and bore the blessing of the goddess to those who wore them. When he asked her what she had meant by her people, she replied that she was a gypsy. Salvador was unsure whether he was enchanted or disturbed by this revelation, but of course she would have been equally stunned to know that he was a prince of Callister. She held out the crystal earring to Salvador, stating that someone favored by the goddess should carry a blessing of the heavens with him. At first, Salvador was hesitant, but she forced the little earring into his hand and smiled, telling him that she had greatly enjoyed their dance, but that she had to be leaving now. Before Salvador could argue to ask her to stay a bit longer, she released his hands and fled into the crowd. In a moment, she had vanished, and there Salvador was left, his glistening blue eyes searching the crowd for the Fabian gypsy, as he stood in the center of the dancing circle, clutching the little crystal earring tightly in his hands. Salvador had returned to his friends sitting at the banquet table after staring off into nothingness for several moments. He held the crystal earring tightly in his palm as he silently took a seat beside Atticus and Marcus. Atticus had intended to tease Salvador about his captivation with the Fabian girl, but changed his mind when he saw the turmoil in his brother's face. His entire way of thinking had been disrupted, and suddenly he no longer knew who it was who was his enemy. Who was to blame for the death of his parents? Marcus noticed the distress in Salvador's eyes and gave his friend a caring pat on the shoulder. Salvador returned the friendly gesture with a grin. The three princes returned to their meals, which by now had gotten cold, but none of them seemed to notice. Their minds were far from their food at that point. They were too distracted with trying to sort out what had just happened in their minds. Atticus was too stunned to speak or offer any sort of comment on what he had seen. He partially wanted to tease his brother for the bewilderment over the pretty girl, but he also wanted to ask Salvador how he had learned to dance so well. But somehow, he wanted to avoid the topic of Salvador's seclusion. It seemed like a sensitive subject, and Atticus feared that reminding Salvador of his isolation would only tempt him to return to his chamber once again. Atticus hoped that his brother would not wish to go back to the chamber, and would return to the way life had been before the death of their parents. For that reason, Atticus kept quiet. Night had fallen by that time, and a cold breeze drifted through the marketplace, driving some people away. But there was still a merry air between them, for despite the cold food, the chilling breeze and the silenced music, and Salvador's sudden brood, they were all together again. And as long as the three of them were together, nothing else in the world mattered.